I discovered tiny hidden cameras aimed at my outdoor shower, disguised along the fence between my yard and my neighbor's. At first I thought it was a prank, but when I traced the devices back to him, it turned into a police case that split our entire community. I am a 27-year-old man who rents a small bungalow behind a larger house in a quiet neighborhood that advertises itself as friendly and private. The yard is my sanctuary. It is ringed by a wooden fence with narrow slats, a line of rosemary, and a simple outdoor shower I built from a home improvement kit, because beach sand is not welcome in my plumbing. I work early shifts, run in the evening, and rinse off under the sky when the light is soft. 2 months ago, while trimming the rosemary, I noticed a glint at eye level between 2 fence boards. At first I thought it was a drop of resin. Then I saw a circle the size of a pea behind a small hole that had not been there the week before. I felt the kind of cold that travels from skin to spine. I fetched a flashlight, shone it through the slat from my side, and the circle flashed back the way a lens does. I did not touch it. I did not announce anything. I stepped back, breathed, and started treating my yard like a crime scene. I took wide and close photographs with a timestamp. I photographed the shower head, the fence line, the hole, the exact distance from the patio paver with the crack that looks like a lightning bolt. I slid a thin sheet of paper between boards and felt plastic, wires, and adhesive putty. I kept my hands off it because I have watched enough people ruin evidence with good intentions. I walked the fence slowly and found 2 more pinholes that pointed toward the shower and the little space where I keep my towel and sandals. One sat behind a knot in the wood that had been drilled out. Another hid under a sliver of bark that had been glued back on. Whoever placed them took time with a blade and a tube of adhesive. On the other side of the fence is my neighbor, a man in his mid-30s who moved in last year with a habit of speaking loudly on the phone about his stock picks and his personal greatness. I will call him the neighbor. He is the type who believes the sidewalk is his porch and that his porch is a stage. I did not walk to his door. I did not send a message. I put on sweats, went inside, and opened the list of steps I keep for bad days. Document, secure, seek help. I pulled the breaker that feeds the exterior outlet near the shower, just in case anyone had tried to siphon power, and I switched off my Wi-Fi so a device could not hop on by accident during investigation. I slept badly and showered indoors the next morning. Over coffee, I read everything I could find about microcameras sold online, about how people hide them in screws, in hooks, in light sensors. The images looked like what I had seen in my fence. The advice was consistent. Do not remove devices yourself if you want a chain of evidence. Call the police, file a report, ask for a forensic technician if one is available. I called the non-emergency line and explained that I believed someone had installed covert cameras pointing at my private shower. The dispatcher asked if anyone was in immediate danger. I said no, but the devices were active. She scheduled an officer to meet me and advised me not to confront anyone. That afternoon, 2 officers came, one older, one younger. I led them through the side gate and showed the pinholes. The older officer crouched, looked through the slats from my side, and exhaled the kind of breath that says, "Here we go." He radioed a supervisor and asked for a technician who could remove electronics without destroying them. While we waited, he asked me to walk him through the week. I told him when I had last used the shower, the times I am away, the fact that my yard is locked from the alley, and that the only other person who has stepped back there is my landlord when he fixed a gutter last winter. The younger officer paced the fence line and found a cable tucked along the bottom rail secured with a brown tape. He followed it to a corner where it disappeared into a small hole drilled through the supporting post that abuts the neighbor's side. The officers traded a look that said, "This is not a random prank." A technician arrived in an unmarked car with a pouch of delicate tools. He photographed everything again with a scale card. He used a lighted mirror to peer into the slats. He told me he would remove the devices in a way that preserved the adhesive and the wiring for fingerprints if any existed. He worked with tweezers and patience. He extracted 3 tiny cylinder cameras with short runs of cable that joined a thicker lead down the post. Each lens had a plastic collar scuffed by installation. The technician bagged everything, labeled it, and then checked the rest of the fence for power or transmitters. There was no battery pack in my yard. No wireless transmitter visible. He followed the drilled pass-through at the corner with a scope and said the line continued under the shared footing into the neighbor's yard. The older officer explained that they could not enter the neighbor's yard without consent or a warrant. He asked if I had any disputes with the neighbor. I said only small things, like his habit of leaving scooters across the shared alley and loud calls. Nothing like this. He asked me not to contact the neighbor and said they would write a report and refer the case to a detective. I signed the property receipt for my statement photos and the seized items. After they left, I felt the weight of the sky grow heavy. I called my sister, who is a practical person with a gentle voice, and told her what had happened. She advised me to do the unglamorous steps. Freeze my consumer credit in case of retaliation. Change my home network password. Keep a log of everything that happens with dates, times, names, and the exact words people use. She also told me to alert my landlord in writing. I wrote a factual email to the landlord with the report number, no accusations, only what the officers had observed. He replied quickly that he was horrified, that he would cooperate with any investigation, and that privacy was paramount to him. He added that he had served as a volunteer on a neighborhood watch and would support whatever steps the police recommended. I wanted to believe every word. That evening I noticed two things. First, a faint residue line on the outside of the fence where a cable had been tacked, mostly hidden by the rosemary. Second, a tiny piece of blue painter tape stuck behind a planter, the kind people use to mark measurements. I photographed both, added them to the log, and then forced myself to eat dinner. 3 days later, a detective called. He said the devices had serial numbers faintly stamped on the inside collar. The lab had also lifted partial prints on one of the adhesive carriers. Not enough to identify someone yet, but enough to compare later. The serial numbers were the first big clue. They traced to a brand sold primarily through a large online retailer. The detective obtained purchase records for that brand in our zip code for the past 3 months. I learned this later. At the time, he only told me that they were following a lead, and that I should consider installing a keyed lock on my side gate if I did not already have one. I added a keyed latch that night and a motion light that went on and off like a nervous lighthouse. I also installed a real privacy screen around the shower, not because it was my fault, but because peace of mind is worth money. I still showered indoors. Every rustle sounded like someone watching. My body felt like a door with a broken latch. I kept telling myself that staying calm, writing everything down, and letting the investigation breathe was the smartest thing I could do. Friends suggested everything from setting a trap with decoy footage to confronting the neighbor on camera. I stuck with document, secure, seek help. It felt boring, and it felt right. 4 days later, the detective called again and asked if I could meet him at the station to review a photo lineup. He said the retailer had complied, and that one of the purchases matched the exact model and quantity of cameras removed from my fence. The account had a name, a delivery address, and a history that included other home electronic items. He did not tell me whose name was on the account over the phone. At the station, he placed 6 photographs on the table. I recognized one face immediately. The neighbor. The detective saw my reaction and nodded. The order history showed 3 separate purchases over a month. The shipping address was the house next door. The name on the account matched the neighbor's name that I had seen on his mailbox. The detective said that did not prove he installed the devices, but it justified a warrant to search his yard and any connected recording equipment. The next morning, a team served the warrant. I stayed inside my house with the shades drawn and my heart thudding against the glass. I heard voices, then the sound of a gate, then a thump like a toolbox set down. An hour later, the detective knocked on my door. They had found a small weatherproof box mounted low on the neighbor's side of the fence, where it meets the shared post. Inside was a basic video recorder with a memory card and a power bank. From that box, 3 thin cables had run through the drilled holes to the pinhole lenses on my side. They also found a larger device inside the neighbor's garage that acted as a hub. The detective said they had seized everything and would examine the card to see what had been recorded and for how long. I asked a question that felt like swallowing a blade. Would I have to watch any of it? He said probably not, unless the case went to trial and the defense contested identification, and even then they would try to spare me direct exposure by using still frames showing angles and timestamps without revealing more than necessary. I went for a long run that evening and hated the way my body felt like evidence even to me. I told myself again that quiet persistence beats loud chaos. The day after the warrant, the neighbor attempted a version of normal. He waved from his driveway as if the sky had not just dropped on both of us. He raised his voice so I would hear that someone at his job had messed up his packages. He made a show of hauling a recycling bin so that I would notice how busy and innocent he was. I went inside without acknowledging him. I wrote down the time and the content of his theater and made dinner. 2 days after the search, the detective called with a measured voice. The memory card contained recordings from multiple days. The timestamps matched evenings when I had been home and using the yard. The recordings were focused on my shower and the small area where I hang my towel. There were also hours of empty yard and the occasional raccoon. The detective said the footage would be sealed as evidence and not copied beyond the scope of the case. He asked if I wanted to pursue a restraining order. I said yes. He connected me with a victim services advocate who explained the process in plain language without acronyms. I would file a petition for a stay-away order based on invasion of privacy and ongoing fear. I would attach the police report, the evidence inventory, and my declaration. A judge would decide whether to issue a temporary order and set a hearing for a permanent order. I filled out the forms that night with the help of the advocate over the phone. I described the first glint in the fence, the removal, the purchase records, the seizure of the recorder, and the way my days now sounded like footsteps that might be real. I filed the petition first thing in the morning. The court clerk stamped it and told me to check my email for the judge's decision by late afternoon. I went home and sat on my porch not to enjoy the day but to prove I still had one. The email arrived just after lunch. The judge granted a temporary stay-away order requiring the neighbor to keep a specific distance from me and prohibiting any contact in any form. The order also restricted him from possessing any surveillance devices aimed at my property. A hearing was set for 3 weeks later. A deputy served the papers on the neighbor that evening. I heard his voice rise, then fall, then the sound of a door. I logged the time and tried to watch a silly show with the volume low. That night, for the first time in a week, I stood next to the outdoor shower and let the water run over my hands without stepping in. I told myself that healing would be boring and slow. I could do boring and slow. Update 1. The detective asked me to come in to sign an additional release so the lab could pull still frames that showed the placement of the lenses without revealing my body. He explained that the prosecution needed images to show the judge and, later, a jury if it came to that. I signed. He also walked me through the retail timeline. The neighbor's account had purchased a pack of 3 microcameras labeled as decorative screws, then a longer cable kit, then a replacement recorder, after a first recorder had spotty reviews. All were delivered to his address. The delivery photos showed packages on his porch. The account had also ordered a tiny drill bit set and a tube of construction adhesive in the same week the holes appeared. The detective said that the retailer had complied quickly because the request was specific and the case description referenced unlawful recording. I asked what charges were likely. He said the district attorney was reviewing. Potential counts included invasion of privacy and unlawful recording of an individual in a place where that person had a reasonable expectation of privacy. The wording felt clinical and solid. He warned me that defense counsel might try to argue that a yard is not private because it is outdoors. He added that local law is clear that a walled or fenced bathing area is private, and that cameras aimed through a fence defeat any honest claim of mistake. I asked whether the neighbor had said anything during the search. The detective said he had attempted to call the devices a home security project for his own property, then insisted that if anything pointed through the fence, it must have been accidental. The detective said the cabling told a different story. The lines were tied off in neat loops, the drilled path was intentional, and the lenses were aimed like a tripod. He also said something that I wrote down because it gave me strength. In cases like this, facts eventually drown theater. The temporary order held. The neighbor avoided me for a week. Then a letter arrived from a law firm with a name that sounded like steel. It said their client denied wrongdoing, that any devices were part of a do-it-yourself security project, and that I should cease defaming him to other neighbors. I forwarded the letter to the detective and the advocate. The advocate told me to say nothing to the law firm and to let the process play out. She reminded me again that my job was to tell the truth once and keep living. In the meantime, I installed a tall privacy pergola over the shower area, cedar posts, slatted roof, and a climbing vine that will someday turn the structure into a green tent. I did it because I wanted to choose something that was not fear. I also added a simple chime on the side gate that rings a single note when anyone opens it. Quiet changes that favor my nervous system. The hearing on the restraining order arrived faster than I expected and slower than I needed. I wore a plain shirt. My hands shook only a little. The neighbor arrived with counsel. He did not look at me. The judge asked everyone to use simple language. The detective testified about the devices, the purchase trail, and the seizure. The lab technician described how he recovered the lenses. The neighbor's counsel argued that the fence is shared and that my shower is outdoors. The judge asked a single question that rearranged the air. If you only intended to secure your yard, why drill through a shared post and aim 3 lenses into a walled bathing area? Counsel said the devices were misaligned. The judge raised an eyebrow that needed no translation. The judge granted a 1-year stay-away order with conditions. The courtroom felt like a window opening. The advocate squeezed my shoulder in the hallway and reminded me to drink water. I went home and slept for 3 hours in the afternoon like a child after a long field trip. Update 2. 2 weeks later, the district attorney charged the neighbor with invasion of privacy and unlawful recording of a person in a place of expected privacy. An arraignment date was set. The paper listed both counts in long words that finally named what had happened. My landlord wrote to say he supported me and that he would deliver any footage from the shared driveway camera if the detective wanted it. The detective collected it. The driveway camera showed the neighbor carrying a small power tool case toward the shared fence on a Saturday morning and returning with it 20 minutes later. The camera did not see the actual drilling, only the before and after, but it helped establish a timeline. The news traveled faster than I could. The block has a group chat for lost cats and potlucks. Someone asked a vague question about recent police activity. Someone else said maybe it was about car break-ins. Then silence settled in that particular way. That says everybody knows and nobody wants to say out loud. Mrs. Green from 2 houses down knocked on my door with cookies in the sentence that sits between comfort and curiosity. She said she had heard something and wanted to make sure I was all right. I told her the truth without details. She said people are always shocked until they remember that privacy is a real thing that needs walls and laws. I thanked her for the cookies and for the sentence that did not try to blur anything. A week later, the neighborhood association held its monthly meeting in a garage with folding chairs. I went because I wanted to see faces. The chair opened with announcements about a street tree grant and a barbecue in the park. Then he cleared his throat and said there had been concerns about surveillance and that we should all be respectful of one another. A man in a sports team jacket said perhaps the cameras had been for safety, and that sometimes people get carried away with words like invasion. A woman with a dog on her lap said she values privacy, but also mentions that crime is rising and that homeowners need tools. I felt the old cold rise and I chose to stand. I spoke without names. I said that a person has the right to bathe in private behind a fence and that drilling holes to insert lenses aimed at that space is not a conversation about safety, it is a crime. I said that anyone who blurs that line is telling the victims in this room that our bodies are not ours when we stand under our own water. The garage went quiet. The chair thanked me and added that the association would share a link to the city statement on residential privacy. After the meeting, 2 people came up to say they were sorry. One person whispered that the neighbor had always given them a wrong feeling, but they did not want to be unkind. I learned that a community can be both kind and lazy at the same time, and that truth spoken calmly can sometimes wake it up. Update 3. The neighbor pled not guilty at arraignment. His counsel filed a motion suggesting the devices were misdirected home security equipment that happened to catch a view through the fence, and that there was no intent to record a person. The district attorney responded with photographs of the drilled paths, the deliberate placement of 3 lenses at 3 heights, and the still frames that showed the shower area clearly framed by wood slats. The judge scheduled a hearing on the motion. The detective called me the day before that hearing and told me something important that became the turn in my story. While preparing for court, they had run the neighbor's name through prior complaints. 18 months earlier, a tenant in a different building, owned by the same landlord, had filed a report that a small camera had been found facing a communal laundry area where a utility sink was used by residents to rinse off after runs. The model was similar to the ones removed from my fence. The case had gone nowhere back then because the device had been removed before police arrived and there was no clear suspect. The complaint, however, included a witness statement that the neighbor had been seen handling a drill near the laundry wall. The witness had moved out and did not want to testify back then. The detective tracked the witness down, and this time the witness agreed to provide a statement, now that there was a new case with physical evidence. At the hearing, the district attorney introduced the prior incident for limited purposes to show pattern and intent. The judge allowed it with a careful instruction. The defense argued that this was character assassination. The judge replied that pattern matters when devices do not drill themselves. The motion to dismiss was denied. The case would proceed to trial unless a plea was entered. In the weeks before trial, my daily life simplified to practical rituals. I ran at different hours. I checked my locks once, not 5 times. I watered the vines on the pergola and watched tiny green hands learn to climb. Friends kept asking if I was ready to testify. I answered with the only sentence that helped. I am ready to tell the truth one time, slowly. A mediation meeting was scheduled. The defense offered a plea to a lesser misdemeanor with no jail time, no admission of intent, and community service. The district attorney asked my view. I asked what a trial would mean for me. He said I would testify, the technician would testify, and they would use still images, not moving footage, to protect my dignity. He also said there is never a guarantee with a jury. I thought about the association meeting, about kind people who want to be comfortable. I said I would support a plea only if it acknowledged invasion of privacy, included a stay-away order that matched the civil one, required surrender of all surveillance devices, and required a class on consent and boundaries. The defense balked at the consent class. The district attorney held firm. A week later, the neighbor accepted a plea to invasion of privacy as a misdemeanor, agreed to probation, community service, the extended stay-away order, seizure of the equipment, and the consent class. There would be no trial. I would not have to watch still frames of my bathing area while strangers looked at their shoes. At sentencing, the judge spoke in a plain voice that felt like a broom clearing a threshold. The judge said that trust is the difference between a neighborhood and a collection of roofs, and that drilling holes for lenses is the opposite of trust. The judge warned the neighbor that any violation of the stay-away order would convert probation into something heavier. I walked out into sun so bright it felt like a clean page. The neighbor moved 2 months later. I do not know where he went. I know only that the vines on my pergola took the shape I asked them to take, which is a roof of leaves that turns afternoon into shade. I kept the chime on the gate. I like the single note that announces what is supposed to happen every time a person enters. I do not owe anyone forgiveness, but I do owe myself rest. I take outdoor showers again on evenings when the light is honey and the world feels like a warm bowl. I do not pretend none of it happened. I simply live in a yard that I chose to fortify with law and wood and stubborn hope. When the plea was entered and the sentence announced, many people assumed the story was finished. The neighbor had moved away, the court file had words that described the crime, and the stay-away order lived in a folder on my desk. But the body does not follow court calendars. Mine still reacted to creaks in the fence and shadows at the wrong angle. The second part of my story is not about the detective or the judge, but about the long work of making a home feel like mine again. In the first week after sentencing, I bought myself a new set of towels. It sounds small, but it mattered. The old ones carried too many echoes. I picked thick cotton in a shade of deep green that reminded me of moss. Each time I hung one on the hook near the shower, I felt like I was planting something steady. I also replaced the toothbrush I kept in the bathroom with a nicer model than before, not because it had been touched, but because I wanted to draw a line under the old days. These were rituals of cleansing that had nothing to do with soap. I also made a document called Privacy Recovery Log. It was not evidence this time, it was simply for me. In it, I wrote down each step I took to reclaim the space. The pergola construction, the chime on the gate, the moment I bought new towels, the first time I showered outdoors again without feeling watched. Writing it down made the victories visible. Trauma hides progress, like fog hides mountains. My log was a way to part the fog. A month later, the tenants, advocacy group that had given me advice invited me to speak at a workshop. They wanted someone who could explain what it feels like to discover surveillance and how to respond without acronyms. I almost said no. But then I remembered the neighborhood association meeting where people minimized what had happened until I spoke calmly. I agreed. At the workshop, I told the story from the beginning. I avoided technical words. I said, I saw a glint. I took photographs. I called the police, and I did not touch the devices. I explained that each of those steps protected the investigation. Then I listed the quiet steps, the chime, the pergola, the towels. People listened. One woman raised her hand and said her landlord had installed cameras in the laundry room and told tenants they were for safety. She had not known how to challenge that. We spoke afterward, and I shared the wording of the privacy law I had learned. That day I realized the story was bigger than me. Another piece of the aftermath was financial. Even though the neighbor was sentenced, I had spent money on locks, lights, and the pergola. My advocate suggested I file a small claims case for restitution, not for the crime itself, but for the practical costs of restoring my privacy. It felt awkward to put a price on peace of mind, but I did the math. The total was just under $2,000. I filed the claim. The hearing was uneventful. The judge read the police report, looked at the receipts, and ordered the neighbor to reimburse me in installments. The first payment arrived 3 weeks later by cashier's check. I deposited it into a savings account labeled Resilience. Naming the account that way made me smile each time I checked the balance. The neighborhood continued to be strange. Some avoided me, as if my story might be contagious. Others nodded with a mix of pity and respect. Mrs. Green kept bringing cookies. Once she told me that when she waters her roses, she now looks at the fence with sharper eyes. Not fear, but vigilance. That small sentence felt like a victory. One evening, the neighborhood chair asked if I would help draft a privacy and respect policy to add to the community guidelines. It was voluntary, symbolic, but I agreed. Together, we wrote a short statement. Every resident has a right to enjoy their home and yard without surveillance or intrusion. Any suspected devices should be reported immediately. Respect means no one's private life is a spectator sport. It was not legally binding, but words matter. They draw lines. And therapy also became part of the story. I met with a counselor who specialized in trauma from invasion of space. She said something that changed how I thought about healing. She said, your body learned that ordinary places can betray you. Healing is teaching it again that ordinary places can hold you. That sentence became a kind of mantra. Each time I used the shower, I repeated it. Each time I unlocked the gate, I said it in my head. Slowly, the lesson sank in. About 6 months after the sentencing, I hosted a barbecue for friends in my yard. We grilled vegetables, told bad jokes, and played music from a small speaker. When I rinsed my hands under the outdoor shower, someone teased me about being dramatic with my moss green towel. For the first time since this began, I laughed near the shower instead of holding my breath. That moment meant more than the court file. It was proof that life could return without disguise. Another unexpected outcome came when a local reporter contacted me. She had heard about the case through public records and wanted to write about privacy rights in residential spaces. I hesitated but agreed on the condition that she not use my full name or address. The article came out with the headline, Hidden Lenses and Hidden Laws. It described the rise of covert cameras and the steps ordinary tenants can take. Reading it was strange. My story had become a cautionary tale, but also a guide. Friends sent me screenshots saying they had learned something. It felt like turning pain into a tool. The last piece of closure came 1 year after discovery. The vines on the pergola had grown thick. They made a living roof that filtered sunlight into green patterns. On that anniversary, I stood under the shower, water cool, vines rustling, and I whispered a promise to myself. I promised that if fear ever tried to build a home in me again, I would answer with patience, law, and stubborn care for my space. I promised to keep choosing life that is boring and safe over drama that is sharp and short.